There is a sound that German soldiers on the Eastern Front described with a particular kind of dread. Not the roar of engines, not the scream of diving aircraft. A silence. A whispering silence in the dark, like the wind moving through tall grass. And then the bombs were already falling, and there was nothing you could do, because you had heard nothing until it was too late. They called the women who made that sound the night witches, and the German pilots who faced them were more afraid of them than of almost anything else the Soviet Air Force could send against them. This is not a story that the history books tell well. It is not a story that appears in most documentaries about the Second World War. It is not a story that Stalin wanted told after the war was over, because it complicated the image he wanted to project of the Soviet Union and of Soviet women, and of what women were supposed to be and supposed to do and supposed to want. So it was buried, filed away. The medals were given, and then the regiment was disbanded, and the women were sent home and told, in the way that authoritarian governments tell people things, that their service was appreciated and that they should now return to being ordinary. They were never ordinary, not one of them. To understand what the night witches were, you have to understand what the Soviet Union looked like in June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in the history of the world. 3 million German troops, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft poured across the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, nearly 2,000 miles wide. The speed of the advance was catastrophic. In the first hours of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground before their crews even had time to respond. Within weeks, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing cities, encircling armies, taking prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. The Soviet military was in crisis. Everything that could be done to stop the German advance had to be done. Every resource, every person, every aircraft, every weapon had to be mobilized. Stalin, who had begun the war in a state of near paralytic shock, he had ignored repeated intelligence warnings that the invasion was coming and had purged much of his best military leadership in the years before the war, eventually recovered his nerve and began making decisions. One of the most consequential decisions made in those early desperate months was made not by Stalin, but by a woman. Marina Raskova was 31 years old in 1941. She was already the most famous female aviator in the Soviet Union, a celebrity pilot who had set long-distance flight records, who had been decorated with the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, who had a face that appeared in Soviet newspapers and whose name was known to every Soviet child. She was the Soviet Amelia Earhart, except that Raskova had survived her record flights, and unlike Earhart, she was also a trained navigator, an aviation instructor, and a woman of formidable organizational and political intelligence. When the war began, Raskova was flooded with letters, hundreds of letters, then thousands of letters, from young Soviet women who wanted to fight. Women who had learned to fly in the Soviet Union's extensive pre-war civilian aviation programs, the WWII, the volunteer aviation clubs that had trained hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, men and women, in the years before the war. Women who could fly, who could navigate, who could service aircraft, who were watching their country being destroyed and who were being told to go home and wait. They did not want to go home and wait. They wrote to Marina Raskova. Raskova did something remarkable. She took the letters to Stalin. It is a measure of the desperation of those early war months and of Raskova's personal standing that Stalin agreed. 3 all-female aviation regiments were authorized. They would train on whatever aircraft were available, and they would fly combat missions. The decision was made in October 1941. The women had until the spring to be ready. The regiment that would become the Night Witches was the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Their aircraft were Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes. The PO-2 was not a warplane. It had never been a warplane. It was a training aircraft, designed in 1928, made of plywood and canvas and wire, with a single engine that produced about 100 horsepower, less power than a modern car, and a top speed of approximately 90 miles per hour. Fully loaded with 2 small bombs, it flew even slower. The German fighters it would face could fly more than 3 times as fast. Any German pilot in a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 who encountered a PO-2 had an aircraft that was so vastly superior in every performance metric that the encounter should have been no contest. The women flew anyway. They flew because they had been given these aircraft and no others, and because the alternative was not flying and not fighting, and there was a war on, and their country was bleeding. They flew because they were 20 years old, and 19 years old, and 22 years old, and they were Soviet women who had grown up believing, because they had been told to believe it, because the Soviet state had invested considerable propaganda energy in making them believe it, that they were equal to men in every meaningful way, that they could do everything men could do, that the Soviet system had created a new kind of human being who was not limited by old distinctions of gender and class and ability. They flew because Marina Raskova asked them to, and because Russia was burning. The training was brutal and fast. The women were given 6 months to become combat ready. They trained through the winter of 1941 into 1942 at Engels on the Volga River, in conditions of extraordinary cold and shortage. There were not enough aircraft for everyone to train on simultaneously. There were not enough flight suits. The women were given men's uniforms and boots several sizes too large, and had to stuff newspaper into the boots to make them fit. There were not enough navigational instruments. The parachutes were designed for men and sat wrong on women's bodies. The aircraft had no radios. There were no heating systems in the open cockpits. In Russian winters, at altitude, the temperature could drop to -40 degrees, and the women flew in those temperatures in open cockpits with nothing between them and the wind but their leather helmets and their cotton-lined flight suits. Each crew was 2 women, a pilot and a navigator. The navigator sat in the rear cockpit, behind the pilot, separated by the engine. They communicated by shouting over the wind noise and the engine. They had a compass and a map and a pencil and whatever they could see on the ground below them. No radar, no radio navigation, no electronic aids of any kind. Navigation over the Eastern Front at night, over terrain that might be held by the Germans with no landmarks that could be safely illuminated, was an act of dead reckoning and skill and nerve, and a kind of intuitive spatial intelligence that the best navigators develop over thousands of hours of flying, and that these women had developed in months. The tactic they developed was born of necessity. A PO-2 flying with its engine running could be heard from the ground at considerable distance. Plenty of warning for anti-aircraft crews to track it and open fire, or for German night fighters to be vectored toward it. But a PO-2 with its engine cut, gliding silently toward its target, made almost no sound at all. The whisper of wind in the canvas wings, nothing more. If the pilot cut the engine at sufficient altitude, she could glide for miles in complete silence, release her bombs, pull up, restart the engine at low altitude, and be gone before the Germans on the ground had fully processed what had just happened. It was an extraordinarily dangerous technique. Gliding at night over enemy territory at low altitude with no engine power, with no ability to rapidly climb or accelerate away from a threat, with bombs still to be released, required a level of skill and nerve that is difficult to overstate. The margin for error was almost nothing. A miscalculation of altitude, a gust of wind at the wrong moment, a failure to restart the engine cleanly, any of these could be fatal. The women did it multiple times a night. Each crew flew between 8 and 18 missions every single night, night after night, for 3 years. Nadezhda Popova was one of the most experienced and celebrated of the night witches. She began flying combat missions at age 19. She would eventually fly 852 combat sorties, 852 individual missions over enemy territory at night in a plywood biplane with no radio and no radar and anti-aircraft fire coming up from below and German fighters hunting in the dark. She was shot down twice. She survived both times. After the war, she was asked what she remembered most about those years, and she described looking down from her cockpit at the burning Russian countryside and thinking that every fire she saw below her was a Russian home, a Russian village, Russian people dying, and she flew harder and longer because of it. Polina Gelman was a Jewish woman from Berdichev in Ukraine who had been evacuated when the Germans advanced and who found the night witches and flew 860 combat sorties. 860. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award at age 21. After the war, she became a professor of economics and lived to the age of 91. And in her final years, she gave interviews about what those years had been like and what it had meant to fight. And in those interviews, there is a quality of absolute stillness and certainty about a life fully lived that is one of the most moving things in the historical record of the Second World War. The regimental commander, after Marina Roskova was killed in a plane crash in January 1943, she died in bad weather, ferrying a new aircraft to her regiment, in the kind of ordinary operational accident that claimed more lives in the Second World War than any other cause, was Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a professional pilot of enormous skill and calm authority who led the regiment from 1942 until the end of the war, and who is one of the great unrecognized military commanders of the conflict. The Germans who faced them were baffled at first and then genuinely frightened. German anti-aircraft crews began using a technique of mutual illumination, coordinating multiple searchlights to catch a single PO2 in a cone of light so that fighters could be directed to it. The tactic worked sometimes. When a night witch was caught in the searchlight cone, she had only seconds. Some of the women described flying directly toward the searchlights to blind the operators, then braking hard in a direction that the lights could not follow fast enough. Some flew so low over the German positions that the anti-aircraft guns could not depress their barrels far enough to track them. Some simply flew through the fire and hoped, and were sometimes right, and sometimes not. 30 women of the 588th Regiment were killed in combat. 30 names, most of them under the age of 25 when they died, most of them killed at night over the Eastern Front, with no witnesses to what their final moments looked like. Shot down by fighters, or hit by flak, or simply disappearing into the dark and never found. For every one of them, the mathematics of her loss were specific and devastating. A family somewhere who received a telegram, a crew partner who had flown with her every night for months and who now had to fly without her, a bunk that stayed made in the morning instead of being slept in. The women bonded with an intensity that is common to people who face death together over long periods. They cut each other's hair, sewed each other's uniforms, wrote letters home for each other when someone was too exhausted to write. They shared photographs of their families and talked about their lives before the war and about what they would do when it was over. They were, at the same time, consummate professional soldiers who reported for duty every night without complaint and flew until the flying was done. The combination of that fierce personal intimacy and that absolute professional discipline is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the regiment and one of the things that made them so effective. The Eastern Front they flew over was a landscape of incomprehensible violence. The German invasion and the Soviet defense of the Soviet Union was the largest and bloodiest military campaign in human history. More people died in the siege of Leningrad alone than in the entire Second World War in the Western Allied nations combined. The territory the Night Witches flew over, southern Russia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, the Crimea, eventually Poland and Germany itself as the war turned, was territory where entire populations had been exterminated, where villages had been burned in both directions, where the soil itself was saturated with the dead. The women flew over it every night. They flew over it in their slow canvas biplanes and dropped their small bombs and pulled up and went back for more, because it was what they had to do and because there was no one else to do it. By 1943, the tide of the war was beginning to turn. The catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, the largest single military defeat in the history of any army to that point, had broken the momentum of the German advance. The Kursk tank battle in the summer of 1943 destroyed the last German capacity for large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Army began its long, grinding, enormously costly advance westward, and the Night Witches flew ahead of it, every night, bombing supply lines and troop concentrations and fuel depots and railway junctions and anything that would make the German position harder to hold. They flew over the Kerch Peninsula on the Black Sea coast, one of the most heavily defended German positions in the south. They flew over the Kuban bridgehead, where German forces held on against Soviet pressure for months in a grinding campaign of extraordinary ferocity. They flew over the liberation of Ukraine, over the Crimea, over the Carpathian passes into Poland, over the Vistula River, over the plains of eastern Germany. They flew to the end of the war. In 3 years of combat operations, the regiment flew approximately 23,600 combat sorties. Some sources put the total higher, at close to 30,000, dropped nearly 3 million kilograms of bombs, and received 23 Hero of the Soviet Union awards, the highest Soviet military decoration. 23 Hero of the Soviet Union awards for one regiment. For comparison, the entire United States Army Air Forces awarded fewer than 900 Medal of Honors in the entire war. 23 heroes in one regiment of 80 women who flew plywood biplanes at night is a ratio of recognition that tells you something about how extraordinary their service was, even by the standards of a war that produced extraordinary service everywhere you looked. And then the war ended. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Night Witches had survived. They had flown from the disasters of 1942 to the ruins of Berlin in 1945. They had outlasted the 1,000-year Reich. They had done what they set out to do, and Stalin disbanded their regiment. Not with ceremony, not with the kind of recognition that the scale of their achievement warranted. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was simply dissolved. The women were discharged. They were told to go home. The Soviet military in the post-war years was rebuilding itself as a conventional force, and there was no place in the post-war image of Soviet military power for women in combat roles. The story of the Night Witches was not officially suppressed. Their records existed. Their medals were real. The individual women could talk about their service. But it was not celebrated. It was not incorporated into the official narrative of the war. The Soviet Union had more comfortable stories to tell about its women: the heroic factory workers, the nurses, the mothers who kept the home fires burning. Not the 20-year-old girls who cut their engines over German lines and dropped bombs in the dark. For decades, the Night Witches existed mainly in Soviet memory, in the recollections of the women themselves, in local museums and veterans' gatherings. The women grew old together. They held reunions. They kept the memory alive among themselves because no one else seemed sufficiently interested in keeping it alive for them. Western historians gradually began to piece the story together in the 1970s and 1980s, and after the Soviet Union collapsed and Soviet archives became more accessible, a fuller picture began to emerge. Books were written, a few documentaries were made. But compared to the scale of what these women did, 3 years of nightly combat, over 20,000 sorties, in aircraft that should not have survived contact with the enemy, the recognition they received from the wider world was a small and inadequate thing. Some of them lived long lives. Nadezhda Popova, the woman who flew 852 combat sorties and was shot down twice, died in 2013 at the age of 91. In her final years, she was interviewed by journalists and historians, and she spoke about the war with a clarity and a calm that was the product of a lifetime of having lived with those memories. She talked about her friends who had not come back. She talked about the cold and the dark over enemy territory, and the sound of the engine cutting and then the silence. She talked about what it had been like to be 19 years old and at war. And she said, in one of those interviews, something that has stayed with everyone who has heard it. She said that she had not thought about dying when she flew. She had thought about the target. She had thought about the mission. The dying was a possibility she had accepted and then set aside, because there was no room for it in the cockpit of a PO-2 at 2 in the morning over German lines. That is who these women were. They accepted the possibility of death and set it aside and flew anyway. 852 times in Popova's case, night after night, year after year, in the dark over a burning continent. Their aircraft were made of plywood. Their bombs were small. Their navigational equipment was a compass and a pencil. Their cockpits were open to the Russian winter. They had been flying for less than a year when they flew their first combat mission. By the standards of the most technologically advanced air war in history, they had nothing. And they flew more combat missions than most air units on either side of the war, in more dangerous conditions, against an enemy that regarded shooting one of them down as worthy of an automatic medal, and they flew until the war was over and Germany was defeated and their country was free. History buried them. They deserved better than that. They deserve, at the very least, to be remembered.